Hello and welcome to the Auditing Antics podcast. So, Michelle, the month of April is National Stress Awareness Month.
Oh,
And this is something that I know you and I know very well. I think most people know very well that, life can be stressful.
yeah.
And nowadays, a lot of times, one thing that is making it more difficult is that work can be stressful, life can be stressful. When we think about, society as a whole, that can be stressful. And for me, it's one of those things I notice a lot of people talking about how, there's not ways to essentially be able to get relief from it. If
Mhm.
every area that you're turning to in life has stress attached to it, how do we get away? How do we decompress? How do we work through that? And we've talked in the past before about mental health in general and looking at that from a work perspective. But I think we need to break it down even further for this month from the component of stress, because there's a lot of
Mhm.
times that departments are under a lot of stress, depending on if you're working within an organization or if you're external, you're staffing into a hospital system, maybe you are a part of a team that's outsourcing work. There's always going to be this component of stress.
Mhm. I agree. And how many times during a day does somebody else expect their emergency to become yours? And I think that's something we
Mhm.
encounter a lot in this industry is somebody calling up and saying, "I need you to review this ASAP and get it back to me."
Right.
And you've got
And
to
then
know how to
ask
deal with
you
it.
why you didn't finish what you were working on when they asked you to
And
do
can I
that.
get a status update on those other 20 audits?
Yes, exactly. Now, the American Institute of Stress, which I didn't know that that was a thing, but in some of the research looking into this for the episode today, they have some good articles out there that talk about what it is that you can be looking for as far as signs of stress, how to deal with that in different situations. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was the way that they're referring to the symptoms, and not only symptoms, but how people will commonly react when you're in a stressful situation. So they talk
Mhm.
here about disbelief, shock, numbness, feeling sad, frustrated, helpless, difficulty concentrating and making decisions, headaches, back pains, stomach problems.
Gee,
I'm
this sounds familiar.
I'm laughing at that because Michelle and I are constantly going to our chiropractor for our neck and back issues and all that fun stuff. It could be from other things, not stress, but it could be a sign of stress.
My
Um,
massage therapist is always commenting how tense I am, chronically tense all over. And it's like, well, if
yeah.
you have any recommendations that don't include quit my job.
Yes, exactly. And then the last thing they bring out is, the reactions of going essentially to substance use, whether it's smoking, alcohol, drugs, whatever it may be. Um, those are very real things that people deal with, and sometimes they do battle with that, even when it is in relation to their professional life and their job. Michelle, one of the things that I think stands out from my own experience is the two areas talking about feeling frustrated and helpless, and also the difficulty in decision making.
Hmm.
And, that kind of will paralyze you, especially if you're in a coding position and an auditing
Yeah.
position. I know even for you and I in years past, not current, but in years past, we've worked on some audit projects together. I'm leading a project, you're working as an auditor, and I'm even hesitant because the client is just constantly changing their viewpoint. So it
Yeah.
was like every day we're coming in and they're contradicting themselves, asking why we didn't know to do it a certain way when they didn't even know what they wanted. things like that can be very stressful, and I know within coding departments that happens a lot as well, and billing departments, I'm sure, when you
Yeah.
don't have clear direction.
Yeah, and it's stressful enough because coding is extremely subjective. And a lot of times when you're working in a situation where there is no definitive policies or guidelines, you are getting those, today it's going to be this, tomorrow it's going to be a next. So now I've got to do this guessing game of where your head is at. And I'm actually really surprised to hear you call out like the difficulty making the decision, because I feel like I'm more so the one who is apt to overthink something than, and you're just usually like, oh, stop it, do like, no, it's this over here, or like, yes, I agree with you, why are you questioning this, so it's kind of interesting to me that you're calling out that difficulty making a decision, but I do
Oh,
think
I
it's
have
something
that.
that we
Yeah.
see regularly. I know from fellow auditors, I've had conversations where, they're just like, I just want to put the right recommendation down, and is it right, is it wrong? And I know something that I have put into place for me is a time limit. When I'm having times where my anxiety is a little bit more heightened, like I'm usually pretty self aware. I've dealt with anxiety for years and years and years, and it's brought on by different things, not necessarily work related. However, it does manifest itself through my work. So one of the things that I have done for myself personally is I put a time limit on myself, and I at the end of that time limit I make a decision and I move on. And um you know at the end of the day, the client can review that and come back, and I can re-review it and either decide to agree with the client or stick to what I've put on there. It's not going to be career ending because
Right.
somebody disagrees with the decision you've made. And I used to view that as like career ending level of stress that I would put
Yeah.
on myself. Not somebody else putting that stress on me. It was me putting that
Yeah.
stress on myself. So I think we have to be able to take that step back and evaluate the situation and realize it's really not that serious.
Right. Right.
Which, as you talked about in years past, like that became personally very debilitating to me, not just in my work, but outside of work, being able to function. Any type of choice I had to make became impossible.
Mhm.
And I look back on that time and it was like, no wonder I didn't end up in the loony bin.
Yeah.
Thank goodness for people around me who, were able to be like, you need to go get help and such. But sometimes you can just become so l- wrapped up in all of this stress that the stress compounds on the stress. And then it's like anything you have to do
Mhm.
is is earth shattering to your body and your nervous system.
Yeah. Well, and that's what makes it so difficult too when you are going through something like this. You do tend to internalize it
Hmm.
because, you're already thinking about, okay, well, what if I make this wrong decision? Or I've got all this pressure from my manager to do these things and it's not possible. Then people will, work off the clock or do really crazy things thinking that they're
Yeah.
fixing the problem when, you really need to be able to just step back and reevaluate what's going on. One of the things for me when I talk about something like this now that I think is very important for people to understand. This has been a process and a journey for me. This is
Same
not
here.
something where I was able to just handle it like this for my entire existence. I should say as an adult working. But, thinking back to before, I also would put a lot of the pressure and a lot of the stress on myself, trying to anticipate what somebody else would potentially think about what it is that I was doing.
Mhm.
So, A lot of what has helped me realistically first is getting on medication that I needed desperately and kept pushing off, not wanting to
Yep.
take that step. I needed it, and it's completely changed my ability to function, really. And, when we think about the different ways you can look for that outside support, obviously, both of us agree medication was good for us.
Mhm.
Therapy was huge for me because
Yeah.
I couldn't get out of my own head.
Mhm.
And the more stress that I got, a lot of my stress I was putting on myself, but the more stress that I was feeling, the more that I couldn't stop that negative self-talk, couldn't stop the, continual thoughts about the doom and gloom and all of these ridiculous things. But when, to your point, when you're in it, you don't see the big picture.
Mm-mm.
And if you are internalizing things, you're not allowing yourself to have that external input to help pull you out of it or to help put it into perspective. So, now I am able to handle stress differently, but there's ways that you can learn from it as well. And I think that that's a really big component to this
Yes.
because it can feel overwhelming when you're in the middle of a situation. But for me, for example, with that project I was talking about, that was just pretty much a nightmare. It was the worst project I've ever worked on in my entire life, to the point where I did have a breakdown. And I've never had something like that happen where I had a breakdown. But with the client and the communication and the constant move of the goalpost and not understanding, oh, we're going to apply this ICD 10 guideline, but ignore that ICD 10 guideline. Here's a progress note, but we're not going to code from this section even though it's in there, we're not going to code from here. You only code from there. It was just so much of trying to please the client, continue like, okay, we got this. We're just going to make our list even bigger that we need to
Mhm.
follow and make sure we're doing things correctly until the list becomes multiple pages. And then they think it's getting worse. And it's like, okay, I can't do this.
Yeah.
And that was an awful feeling. It was awful to wake up and have to work that project every day. And I know you and I were knee deep in that together, but just working on it and going into a work queue and not knowing if the decision you're making on that one level 3 encounter
Trying to
is going
guess.
to, yes, yeah, it
What are
was
they
just
thinking or feeling today?
yes, yeah, you can only imagine how awful and how much that compounded to the point where I didn't step in. And, I thought I was handling it. I thought I was managing it. I thought I could make it better. And, at the end of the day, I learned a lot from that project because there were a lot of things that could have been done from the beginning of that project to set up proper expectations
Mhm.
and to fully understand what it is that that particular client was looking for. And, at the end of the day, it was a massive relief when we got to release and we weren't a part of that particular project anymore. They went on their way and just, did their own thing because that's what they wanted to do to begin with. Um, but, it's also dealing with the thoughts of the outcome,
Mhm.
the disappointment, letting down. For me, I let it compound to the point where it got so bad that I didn't even care. I was just glad it was gone. But
Yes.
I never wanna get back to that point again. It was
No.
awful, and I don't feel like that is a reflection of me as a person, as me in my professional
Mhm.
life, and it was just like you were saying, it was debilitating, and that
Yeah.
was me in a leadership role and you in an auditing role.
Yeah. It I can remember those daily conversations with you just saying, what am I not getting? What am I doing wrong?" And it would just come down to we were not wrong, and it became apparent by the daily feedback that we were getting that it was never going to be consistent. We were never going to have something consistent to gauge this to, or even to bring our work closer to their expectation. We never would have been able
Mhm.
to.
Yeah.
But I think when we find ourselves in situations like that, one thing that I learned from those types of situations, which that was stressful for me, but on a much lower level, I think, than it was stressful for you, because I was just having to sit there, every day getting my list of this is what we say you do wrong today, whereas you had to actually go back to the client, back and forth, and try to come to some kind of understanding. But I think for me, um when things they got really bad, then they got better, and then I decided I want to move into auditing, and with anything new becomes this new level of stress.
Mhm.
And like when I went to doctor's management, you already were there. You're this rock star producer. You meet with the clients. There's nothing Stephanie Allard cannot do. Like, and I'm not being sarcastic, because she really is like that. It's quite phenomenal. I don't think I've seen anybody put something in front of you that you haven't been able to come up with some kind of answer, or have a resource to say, I may not be the best one to answer this, but I'm going to contact this person over here and get the information we need. And you just do that so seamlessly. That's why I'm like, what do you mean you can't make a decision? Um, um, and I was starting to, do a couple webinars, and they, were wanting me to move into a client contact role. And I very quickly was like, nope, mm-mm, this is not for me.
You knew
And
your limit.
yeah, and um I had to be able to speak up for myself. And I'm going to use the word boundary, place a boundary, and say this is not for me, and that's okay. It doesn't make me any less of a person. It doesn't make me any worse at my job, but I am not cut from the same. I mean, we are sisters, but I am not the same as you. You know what I mean? Like I I I have different things that I enjoy doing, and I have different interests, and I
Mhm.
just prefer to do the auditing side of things. And when I place that boundary, I just remember the stress leading up to that conversation of saying, I don't want to do any of that.
Mhm.
And then I remember I called and talked to Lori, and Lori is like a saint. you know, she, she was like, I totally understand. She goes, that must have been so hard for you to have this conversation with me, thinking, that we had these expectations over here and would only accept you if you lived up to these expectations and were just like Stephanie. And, it was so nice to be able to say, this is where I thrive. Let me be here. And they
Right.
do, and they did. That's still quite a boundary I have set. The only person I've allowed to cross that line is you, including this podcast. I remember when you first started talking about doing the podcast. Talk about stress. And then, like, you're
And
like,
then I'm like,
we
"Oh, we don't need notes. We're just gonna wing it."
yeah, and I'm like, I can't just wing it. Like, on a good day, it takes me a minute to find my words. So, you know, I think it's evident sometimes I just lose my train of thought. I get distracted, squirrel. Um, but it's it's something that looks different for everybody, and you're not less of an employee because you want to do something different, or
Mhm.
you thrive in a different environment. You don't want that pressure on you, and that's okay. It doesn't make your work ethic any less, doesn't make you any less valuable. And then you also have to be able to separate out the things, I think, that are causing you stress.
Mhm.
One thing that is really hard as somebody who works from home is my work is always here. And I know, Stephanie, in years past, I mean, I can remember when you and I lived a mile apart
Mhm.
in New York, how many nights I mean, you were waking up at 5 a.m. and I'd come over there for, dinner and hang out with you and the girls, and you'd still be working at 7 at night.
Yeah.
And, it was this
But
gotta
that was a lot of my unhealthy handling
yes,
of stress or even
yes,
pressure. You know, it was what
yeah.
I was putting on myself
Yeah, not
at that
setting that
time.
boundary, not
Right.
separating the two, saying it's okay to take time for myself.
Mhm.
And I don't know how you sustained that
I don't
over
know
the
how
years.
either. And now at this age, you know, one of the things that I think about is what all of that does to you as you move forward and as you age, because, you know,
We're finding out.
we're going through our own medical journeys right now.
Yep.
But one of the things that really stood out to me, even, you know, about, I don't know, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I can't remember at this point, but my husband and I had been going through couples therapy. And a large part of what we were trying to deal with in understanding each other in communication is the fact that I was constantly, and this was before I was medicated.
Don't
I
worry,
got to
folks.
put
I
that out there.
finally convinced her in the merits of medication.
Yeah. So it's probably 2 years at this point. But there was like every point of my life I was putting stress on myself because I always thought things had to be a certain way. And
Yeah.
when you think about home life, you think about raising teenagers, forget it. I probably put myself half in the grave with that alone. But I laugh about it, but one of the things that stood out to me with the therapist at the time, he's great, and he's basically like, you know, "What do you think you're doing to yourself?" He's like, "This is not just your mind that you are affecting. There are
Mhm.
physical outcomes that can come from constant heightened levels of stress."
Yep.
And that's one of the things I've been thinking about more because going through like last year having diverticulosis, I'm young to have that as a diagnosis and an issue. And I do wonder at times, you know, did all of the years of stress contribute to that? You know, what else am I having to kind of backpedal and make
Mhm.
sure that I'm healthier now at this point as I continue through the aging process? But it's a real thing when when you look at, and you know, after he said that to me, I did start to do some research. And you know, there's all different things related to cardiac conditions that can occur when you think about the different hormones that are released into your bloodstream because you're
Yep.
stressing constantly and at this heightened level. There's
Mhm.
all of these different ways, gut issues, like I was saying. So, you know, you and I have been pursuing a lot more of health information from the functional medicine approach and looking
Yes.
holistically at what we're doing in our lives, and that's been great. But
And
before, we were pretty much ravaging our systems by just not paying
well,
attention and
yes.
figuring this out sooner than later.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I can't stress enough is be seen by your doctor regularly, because some of these things that I personally have, you know, been diagnosed with, started treating, come to find out, signs and symptoms of those are increased anxiety. Like,
Mhm.
so maybe all these years it wasn't all this other stuff, it was my body and what was going on in it that was imbalanced and not working properly, telling
Mhm.
me, trying to tell me, hello, I need help over here, but you know I don't know. And now, as a result, I am dealing with health concerns and issues of having those heightened times of stress and those, those hormone responses and all those things. So definitely make sure that you're keeping track of those. I know that's, you know, as women, I'm just now learning about all these hormone things at the age of
Yeah.
40, things that I wish I 20s, and I can't recommend enough. for women to go get their hormones tested, because believe it or not, we are not just crazy, insane individuals. You know,
Imagine that.
something may not be working right. Something was not working right for me. So, there is help for it, but
Well, and some of the other things you can do too, and we've done this as well, is just be informed.
mhm,
It's great if you have they're available that you trust, but then a lot of times that's not going to be the case, or maybe, even economically, some people look at that as, I can't afford to seek out this type of health care or whatever it may be. But one thing we do have access to that we can start to focus on is putting in our own time and our own research. And
mhm.
there's so much out there now. You and I talked and joked a couple of episodes ago about lymphatic drainage and doing that.
Yes.
There are doctors out there who are doing videos on that and educating people. There's so many people in the influencer space now that are
Mhm.
coming out, like that
Now,
pediatric physician from the ER that we love to follow.
yes.
Um, there's a lot of ways to get this information without having to go straight to a doctor and only
No.
listen to a doctor. Obviously, you've got to have input of a provider depending on what you're going through. But if we're just dialing it back and thinking about the mental load and the stress that you're going through, start to put it into different buckets to try to understand what the root cause of that is. And
Mhm.
then look at what you're doing in your day to day life to try to prioritize or take care of yourself on an individual level, which can be
Yeah.
very hard.
And just know it doesn't always come down to drinking water, exercising, and meditating,
Yeah.
because none of those things would have helped me, yet for years, that's what I was told to do.
Mhm.
Apparently, I was not hydrated, and that has led to all of this. My brain is thirsty.
Yes. Yes. Well, and when we think about the different tips to try to combat this and ways to overcome it, I think one of the biggest things for me, and I know this is a part of that article I was reading, um, recognizing the fact that you can't change things. There's going to be
No.
a lot of things that are really difficult for you to handle that you can't change.
Yeah.
And that's been huge for me. I've had to let it go, just like Frozen with Elsa and Anna. I've had to let things go
Oh, it's
because
so hard
I
sometimes.
can't yeah, I can't control it, and, you have to think about the outcomes. It may not be something that you would prefer to happen, but it is the
Mhm.
reality, and, I've said this a lot too with parenting an adult child now, and I say that because you don't just stop parenting when they turn 18, and it's incredibly hard, and, it's just one of those things that you have to learn to look at life in a way from a different perspective than what you perceived that was going to look like.
Yeah.
And a lot of people struggle with that big time. There's a lot of people that have pressure from their families due to things like that. But we get one life, and we've got to take care of our bodies now because that is going to be leading up to our longevity, hopefully, and what our career is going to look like. Not only our career, but for me, for a long time, career, yes, was very high on the list, but now, after accomplishing different things, I'm at a point I absolutely love what I do. I'm obviously, not even close to retirement, but also think about the end of your life. Like, how sad is it when people go through all of these years of working and hustling and all of this stuff, and maybe even trying to make other people happy in what they're doing, whether it's at their job or their home
Mhm.
life, and then they die in their 60s or, early 70s, and it's like, oh, all of that, and they never got to live out what they wanted to or
Well, yeah.
pursue what they wanted to, things like that.
And it's just like, I think of when they talk about sh expectations from your workplace.
Mhm.
If you died tomorrow, they could just replace you. They would just replace you and keep going on. Like, I remember this was something that our parents actually early on taught us, and that is anybody can be replaced. You are not so valuable to somebody or a company that they would just cease to exist because you were no longer there. Maybe there would be momentary inconvenience. So take the vacation. These people who
Mhm.
have hundreds of hours of rollover vacation, you do realize that's part of your compensation. And by saving that all up and not taking it, you are not taking advantage
Right.
of your full compensation. Take your vacation time, folks, even if it is a staycation. Take it. We
Yes.
all need that time to just have the break. It's part of our compensation. So think of it that way. Don't think about what work you're leaving when you go on vacation, what you're going to have when you come back. That is owed to you as part of your
Mhm.
compensation. Take
Yes.
advantage.
Yep. Absolutely. All right, so that's some great tips there. I hope, as always, with us being real with what we're dealing with, that really helps to put it into perspective. That's a goal that we've had with this podcast is putting ourselves out there, not only to help get information out there, but to really normalize what it is that we're all going through on a regular basis.
Hmm.
So I hope you all do well till next week. Take care of yourself. Think about what you're doing for self care, even if it's just a few moments throughout the day, and prioritize that to lessen your stress.